The M3 submachine gun was two pieces of stamped sheet metal welded together with a wire coat hanger stock. It cost the US government about $21 to build. That cheapness wasn't a flaw. It's why over 600,000 reached the front, and why the junk gun kept working when better-looking ones didn't. By 1941, the US Army had a problem it could see coming. The standard American submachine gun, the Thompson, was excellent and expensive. Each M1911 Thompson cost the government roughly $225 to produce. Machine steel, walnut furniture, precision tooling, real craftsmanship. That price tag was fine for a peacetime army. It was not fine for a two-front global war that was about to demand submachine guns by the hundreds of thousands. The Army Ordnance Board had also been watching what other combatants were doing. Germany's MP40 and Britain's Sten gun had both moved towards stamped and welded sheet metal construction instead of costly machined parts, a manufacturing shortcut that traded polish for speed. The US needed the same shortcut and needed it fast, ideally without sacrificing the stopping power soldiers already trusted from the .45 ACP round. The Army initiated a formal replacement study, and design work landed with George Hyde, an experienced firearms designer working out of General Motors' Inland Division, with GM engineer Frederick Sampson handling production planning. 5 pre-production models went to Aberdeen Proving Ground for trials in November 1942. By December 1942, the design was formally accepted. Production began at GM's Guide Lamp Division in Indiana, a factory that, until the war, had spent its time stamping out automobile headlights, not weapons. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The M3 wasn't built by a traditional arms manufacturer using traditional arms manufacturing methods. It was built by an assembly line factory using automotive industry stamping techniques repurposed for war. And the result looked exactly like what it was. This wasn't even Hyde's first attempt at solving the problem. An earlier design of his, the M2, had briefly been adopted by the military in April 1942 before it was judged too complex to manufacture at the scale the war demanded and declared obsolete just months later. The M3 that followed was, in effect, a second, more disciplined attempt at the same goal. Simplify everything, machine as little as possible, and accept an unglamorous appearance as the price of speed. Start with what soldiers actually saw when the M3 was handed to them, because their reaction was immediate and consistent. Compared to the Thompson's machined steel and polished walnut stock, the M3 was a shell of stamped sheet metal, seam welded together, with the welds left visible rather than finished smooth. Its stock was a length of bent wire that telescoped into the receiver. Its sights were stamped, not machined. It had no selector switch, no adjustable slots, no wood furniture anywhere on it. Soldiers looked at it and, according to multiple period and post-war accounts, reached the same conclusion. This looked like something assembled in a machine shop out of spare parts, not a real weapon built for war. That reaction wasn't irrational. It was a reasonable read of what the gun visibly was. The receiver really was 2 pressed steel clamshells welded together in a process closer to automobile manufacturing than traditional gunsmithing. The cocking mechanism on the original M3 was an awkward hand crank that required real force to operate and was prone to breaking if the gun was dropped on its side. The magazine release was loose enough that some units modified it in the field, tapping it with a hammer to keep magazines from falling out when the gun was slung on a soldier's shoulder. None of this looked like confidence-inspiring engineering. Soldiers who'd carried a Thompson and knew what a serious weapon was supposed to feel like were openly reluctant to trade theirs in. Some reportedly kept or acquired Thompsons from tank crews rather than accept the M3 as a replacement. But every one of those crude-looking design choices existed to solve the exact problem the Thompson couldn't solve: speed and volume of production at a fraction of the cost without giving up the round that mattered. The finished M3 cost the government approximately $21 per unit, roughly a tenth of the Thompson's price. It required about half the machine hours to build, and roughly a quarter fewer specialized machine tools. That's not a minor efficiency gain. It's the difference between equipping an army in months versus years. The Guide Lamp Division alone produced over 600,000 M3s during the war, plus nearly 49,000 of the improved M3A1 variant. Output that would have been essentially impossible using the Thompson's machining heavy production process. The Ugly design also solved problems the Thompson never had to solve. The M3 weighed several pounds less than a loaded Thompson, had a controllable rate of fire around 450 rounds per minute, slower and easier to manage than the Thompson's 600 to 700, and its stripped-down mechanism meant fewer moving parts to fail and less specialized training required to strip, clean and reassemble it in the field. because it fired the same .45 ACP round as the Thompson and the M1911 pistol already in Army service. Logistics didn't need to change to support it. Ammunition already flowing to the front worked in the new gun without modification. There's also a detail that tells you exactly how disposable the M3 was meant to be by design. The Army initially didn't stock spare parts for it. It was priced cheaply enough that Ordnance calculated it would often be more cost-effective to issue a replacement gun than to repair a broken one, a philosophy that would have been unthinkable for the far more expensive Thompson. The M3 wasn't just cheap to build. It was engineered around the assumption that cheapness itself was an acceptable trade, as long as enough guns kept reaching soldiers who needed them. As for the German side of this story, the documented record is thinner and worth being honest about. Wartime and post-war accounts describe German troops encountering the M3 in the same close-quarters combat where the Thompson had already built a fearsome reputation, and some accounts describe German soldiers initially underestimating the weapon's effectiveness based on its crude appearance. It's consistent with how American soldiers themselves reacted at first, but specific, attributable German field reports on the M3, comparable to the detailed German medical documentation that exists for the .45 ACP round itself, are not as well preserved in the historical record. What is well documented is the American side of the reputation shift. Soldiers who distrusted the gun on sight came to rely on it once they'd used it in combat. The M3's first combat use came almost immediately after it entered production, and it came in one of the most demanding scenarios of the entire war. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions carried M3s into Normandy during the night drop that opened the invasion on June 6, 1944. That's a deliberately punishing test case. Men landing scattered, often alone, in the dark, in hostile territory, needing a compact, reliable, close-quarters weapon the moment they hit the ground, with no opportunity to requisition something better if the gun failed them. The birch fighting that followed in the Normandy hedgerows was exactly the kind of combat the M3 was suited for. Short engagement ranges, dense terrain, fighting measured in yards rather than open field distances, where a controllable, compact automatic weapon mattered more than long-range accuracy. As American forces pushed into French and German towns later in 1944 and into 1945, the same close-quarters logic applied to urban and building-clearing combat. Corridors, doorways, and stairwells where the M3's size and low recoil made it easier to bring to bear quickly than a full-length rifle. Tank and vehicle crews became one of the M3's most important and longest-lasting user groups, and this is where its stamped steel, compact design paid off most clearly. A tank crew that had to bail out of a disabled vehicle needed a weapon that would fit inside a cramped turret or hull in the first place, and the M3's collapsible wire stock and short overall length made it far more practical to stow than a Thompson or a full-length rifle. That single design advantage, being small enough to carry inside a vehicle, is a major reason the M3 outlived nearly every other weapon fielded in World War II, remaining standard issue for American tank and vehicle crews for decades afterward. The Office of Strategic Services also adopted a specialized version of the M3 chambered to accept 9mm ammunition, useful for resistance and clandestine operations in Europe where American .45 ACP supply couldn't always be guaranteed, but 9mm ammunition, widely used by both Allied and Axis forces, often could be found or captured locally. None of this erases the fact that soldiers, by multiple documented accounts, initially treated the M3 as a downgrade from the Thompson. What the combat record shows is that the initial assessment based on appearance and the eventual assessment based on performance in the field diverged sharply, and it was the second one that stuck. The OSS's 9mm conversions also points to something broader about how the M3 was used well outside conventional infantry combat. Because it was cheap, compact, and easy to modify, it became a natural platform for specialized roles the Thompson was never well suited for. Clandestine supply drops to resistance networks, equipping partisan fighters with a weapon simple enough to train on quickly, and arming personnel whose primary job wasn't frontline combat, but who needed something more than a pistol if things went wrong. That flexibility was, again, a direct consequence of the gun's low cost and simple construction. A $21 weapon could be issued more liberally, modified more freely, and risked more casually than a $225 one. And in a global war fought across dozens of theaters and roles, that kind of flexibility mattered as much as raw combat performance. The M3's reputation earned in combat wasn't unqualified, and it's worth being direct about where the complaints were legitimate rather than just cosmetic. The magazine and feed system were genuine, repeated sources of trouble. Soldiers reported that the M3's single feed magazine was difficult to load fully and prone to jamming when dirt or grit got into the mechanism. A serious issue for a weapon meant to function in mud, sand, and battlefield debris. A Yank magazine correspondent documented infantry units modifying the loose magazine release with a hammer to stop magazines from falling out during normal carry. The Army eventually issued a dedicated loading tool and protective covers to reduce these problems, and a broader revision program beginning in April 1944 addressed some of the worst early issues, culminating in the improved M3A1 variant, which replaced the failure-prone hand-crank cocking mechanism with a simpler fingerhole design built directly into the bolt. The M3's lower rate of fire compared to the Thompson is also a legitimate point of comparison, not just a design footnote. At roughly 450 rounds per minute against the Thompson's 600 to 700, the M3 put less total lead down range per second. Whether that counted as a disadvantage depended on who you asked. Ordnance and many users argued the slower rate made the weapon easier to control and more accurate in short bursts. But it's fair to note the M3 was not simply a strict upgrade over the Thompson in every measurable category. It was a different set of trade-offs, not a Thompson made better in every respect. It's also worth being precise about the German soldiers called it junk framing in the video's title. That's a reasonable characterization of how the gun was received, based on its resemblance to the earlier, poorly regarded weapon it's most directly comparable to in appearance. But the strongest, most consistently documented version of initial contempt followed by earned respect is the American soldier's own experience with his own weapon, not a specific attributable German assessment. Where this video states German reactions, it's presenting the more general, better supported pattern of enemy underestimation based on outward appearance, not a specific quoted account. The M3 and its improved M3A1 variant were officially phased out of frontline US infantry service by 1957, replaced by newer rifles as the Army modernized. But that wasn't the end of its service life, not close. Because it remained compact enough to store inside armored vehicles, the M3A1 stayed the standard personal weapon for American tank, armored vehicle and truck crews for decades afterward. It armed crews through the Korean War, through Vietnam, and it was still issued to tank and engineer battalions during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, nearly 50 years after it entered production. The Army didn't officially retire it until 1992, making the M3 the longest-serving submachine gun in US military history. That's the real legacy of the WWII gun. It outlasted almost everything that looked better than it did because it was built around a manufacturing philosophy, speed, cost, and simplicity over polish that turned out to matter more in practice than appearance ever did. The M3 looked like something welded together in a machine shop because that's essentially what it was. And that cheap, unglamorous construction is exactly why it could be built by the hundreds of thousands and why it kept working in tanks and hedgerows and doorways for the next 50 years. If you want more stories like this, objects that earned their reputation the hard way after everyone assumed they wouldn't, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.